Good morning and welcome to Trevor Phillips on Sunday. Ooh la 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 la, as the French almost never say. In politics, it's getting hotter. In the very week that our government makes it easier to visit our neighbours across the Channel, a bitter war of words breaks out between our nearest, France, and our dearest, America. The deal to provide nuclear-powered submarines to Australia with American technology has enraged President Macron and left the Entente pretty far from cordial. It all comes at the worst possible moment for our government as we approach COP26 in Glasgow, the crucial conference on climate change. If there's a deal to be had, someone is going to have to cool down the diplomatic temperature. And the Prime Minister is off to the UN in New York to do his best. Can he fix it? Well, we'll be joined by the man he appointed to deliver the deal on climate change, and we'll hear from a former CIA boss and confidant to not just one, but two presidents. That's assuming the government can keep the lights on for at least the next hour amidst growing concerns and crisis talks over the UK's energy supplies. Joining us today from the government, the Minister in charge of the UN climate talks, Alok Sharma. We'll speak to Green MP Caroline Lucas about what she would do to avoid an energy crisis this winter. And Labour's Pat McFadden accuses the government of a failure to plan that has left businesses and consumers dangerously exposed. We'll speak to one of the government's scientific advisors about COVID, Professor Stephen Reicher, a member of the SAGE Subcommittee on Behavioural Science. Former CIA boss and US Defence Secretary Leon Panetta tells us why he thinks the French should be more supportive after Washington upended their biggest defence contract. And in return, French diplomat Gerard Araud offers the perspective from Paris. He says the UK is being run by Monty Python and France has been betrayed. But first, I'm joined by the president for COP26, Alok Sharma. Mr. Sharma, thank you for joining us. Can you reassure viewers that the lights are going to stay on this winter?
Well, Trevor, thank you for having me on your programme. Well, obviously, people reading what's in the press will be concerned about the supply of energy, the impact on prices. As you will know, the Business Secretary has been having detailed discussions with the sector this weekend. He'll be continuing those today, as there's going to be a roundtable tomorrow. But I think the clear message that is coming out of this is that there is no immediate concern in terms of supply. We don't see any risks going into the winter. And when it comes to prices, we, of course, have an energy price cap. There are also mechanisms such as the warm home discount, which are available to support people as well. So people should be confident that the supplies will be there and that we will be protecting them in terms of price rises. But, of course, we're not complacent about this, and that's precisely why the Business Secretary is having these very detailed discussions with the sector.
I know you've got to say all of that, but this is sort of... I know what people are going to be saying as they're watching. Oh, God, there's the don't panic message from Dad's Army. Now's the moment to panic. We're looking at 70% plus rises in gas prices. Just at a practical level, isn't it a moment where you could, for example, reconsider the cut, the £20 a week cut in universal credit to reassure particularly poor families that they are not going to have to freeze in their homes this winter?
Well, I mean, let's talk about, firstly, the price issue, because that's a very important one. There is a reason we introduced the energy price cap. It is to protect millions of people. And as I said, when it comes to...
it's going to drive suppliers out of business.
Well, when it comes
to...
Four
of them are going to go out of this business.
Let me address that issue. But when it comes to supporting those who are on lower incomes, we, of course, have the warm homes discount, winter fuel payments, and other mechanisms in place. So we are there to support people when it comes to these costs. And actually, you know, talking about the supply... A significant element of the gas supply in the UK is domestic, where we have imports that will be coming from secure places like Norway. And people should feel confident that this is something that the government, of course, is not being complacent about, but they should feel confident that the supply will be there.
But the truth is that you don't know that. You don't know that. And you can issue as many messages of reassurance as you like, but there might be at least a case for saying, let's help those families. Let's at least hold open the possibility that if prices do go up, you can help those families?
Well, we are helping those families. As I said, there is the Warm Homes discount. There are other payments that are made to those on lower incomes. And, of course, we've got the price cap. So that support is absolutely there. And I want to reassure people that is not going away. And as I said, when it comes to supply, at this point in time, we feel confident that there is not a risk. Okay. And of course, this is not about complacency, Trevor. And you made the point about, Dad's army. It certainly isn't that. I mean, I'm a dad, but just to be clear, there's nothing to do with Dad's army. This is a really a laser-like focus that the business secretary has on this issue, and that's why he is convening all these groups and making sure that actually we do have a solution longer term to this. And part of that solution, by the way, since we're going to talk about COP, part of that solution is rolling out more renewables. You know, in the last 10 years, we've quadrupled the amount of renewables we have in the country. We've got the biggest offshore wind sector in the world, Trevor. We want to quadruple that as well by 2030. That's how you take care of energy security and energy supply, is building out domestically when it comes to renewables.
But actually, that's exactly part of the point. Your shadow Energy Secretary Ed Miliband's made the point that you've been talking about renewables and all the rest of it for the last 10 years, but you can't be absolutely sure, because you haven't got on with it, that we will have uninterrupted supply, because there just isn't enough that's been generated by renewables. You haven't opened new nuclear capacity as you said you would.
Well, I think I have to say it's entirely wrong to say that we haven't built out renewables. We've quadrupled the amount of renewables over the last 10 years. And I said we now have the biggest offshore wind sector in the world. And to make this point, people talk a lot about coal, for instance. Back in 2012, Trevor, 40% of our electricity was coming from coal. It's now less than 2%. And by the end of 2024, there will be no more coal in our electricity mix. And the reason is precisely because we have built a big renewable sector.
Will you take the opportunity now then to rule out a new coal mine in Cumbria, which is what is on the cards, and which the government has sort of kicked down the road until after COP26? Why don't you just tell us, no more new coal capacity?
Yeah. Well, so I think in terms of this coal mine, and this has been discussed many times, there is no coal mine at this stage. There's a public inquiry, which is ongoing right now. So,
yeah, I don't want to comment. Say you don't want new coal capacity.
Well, there is a reason that in our sort of democratic processes that we have public inquiries. Everybody gets a chance to have their say, and that inquiry is still running. So let's see what comes out of that. What does the inspectorate say to that? But I go back to this point about coal, which is that we actually are seen around the world as a poster child when it comes to a clean energy transition. And we have built the biggest offshore wind sector in the world. There's no doubt about it. I mean, coal will be history in 2024 in our electricity mix.
But with respect, the very fact that you cannot say directly to me, you know what, we do not, whatever the process is, we would rather not have a new coal mining facility in Cumbria on stream in the next few years. The fact that you cannot say that to me will send a message around the world that actually, though you talk a good game, you don't really do the business.
Trevor, let's see what comes out of the public inquiry. But, my message, I mean, you sort of said that I'm responsible for this climate conference. My message is going around the world and ensuring that we have all countries committing to phasing out coal in their energy mix, as the UK has done. And actually, we are seen as leading in the world in this issue.
All right, well, you're off to New York this afternoon to talk to people from around the world with the Prime Minister to try, I guess, to set up the deal. Your heart must have sunk this week when the Prime Minister and Mr Biden and Mr Morrison announced a new deal, and the French went a bit crazy about it, and the Chinese denounced it as irresponsible. It's not the best diplomatic environment, is it, to get a deal?
Well, look, I mean, this is a trilateral deal between three very close partners. This is about the Indo-Pacific. And we've been very clear, this isn't about provoking anyone. We want to have good relations with all countries. We want to work with mutual trust with all countries.
But they are
in terms of my role...
Whatever you wanted,
well,
they are provoked.
In terms of my role, Trevor, what I can tell you is that I personally have spoken to world leaders, ministers in over 100 governments, and there is a very unified view on this. They do see climate change as an issue which is a great leveller. Climate change does not respect borders, and countries individually see what is going on in their own country. I mean, you've seen, literally in the last few weeks, The horrific flooding that's been in China, in Central Europe, loss of life and livelihoods. You've seen wildfires raging in North America, record temperatures in Europe. This is all down to climate change, and that is why countries recognise that we need to act collectively and together, and why I am told by every country that I speak to is they do want COP26 to be a success.
OK, every country. Simple answer here. You've got 100 leaders who've said they're coming. Has President Xi Jinping of China said he's coming?
No, not yet. But as you know, I was in China recently. I had constructive but very frank discussions with China. And of course, they've made various commitments on cutting emissions, on phasing down the use of coal. And I was very clear. I said to them that we want to see the detailed policy around this. And they, along with every other major economy, the G20, have committed before COP26, Trevor, to come forward with ambitious plans to cut emissions. And I have to say to you that in every conversation I had with the Chinese, they were very clear. They were very clear that they want to see COP26 as a success. So the ball is very much in their court.
Well, there are all kinds of definitions of success, aren't there? China is mining 4 million tonnes of coal a year. It is the biggest emitter in the world. Is Xi Jinping going to turn up and sign a deal? Because without China, it's all pretty meaningless, isn't it?
Well, there's no doubt that China is going to be part of the key to all of this. Absolutely. They're the biggest emitter in the world. And what President Xi Jinping has said is that they're going to strictly restrict the use of coal in this next 5-year period from 2026. They're going to phase down. But of course, we want to see the detail of that. That is what is really important here as well. And that's what we're pressing them on. And I repeat the point. They've said to me they want COP26 to be a success. Well, you know, the ball is in their court. We want them to come forward and make it a success together with the rest of the world.
Talking about detail, your colleagues in Cabinet have just signed a trade deal with the Australians in which they omitted any specific numbers in relation to the Australians' coal production and emissions, which had previously been in what the Australians signed in the Paris Accord. Now, you say the detailed matters. Actually, what your government's just done is taken out the details that would have tied one of the biggest coal producers in the world to proper targets.
Well, Trevor, you're right. Detail absolutely matters, and this deal has not yet been signed. It's an outline form, and the legal text is being worked on. But I just want to clarify this point, that the UK has some of the strongest environmental measures in the world. We are not compromising that in our trade deals. And when it comes to Australia... But let me address that point, because when it comes to Australia, there is absolutely going to be a substantive clause in that deal which makes reference to the commitment of both countries to the Paris Agreement and the goals of the Paris Agreement. So it is going to be there in black and white.
The Australians are going to be tied to numbers.
They are going to be tied to the commitments that are made in the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement is very clear in terms of where we want to see the limiting in temperature rises in the world. And just to be clear that, you know, Parliament, various select committees are going to have an opportunity to scrutinise this deal. They're already looking at the outline. When the detailed text is agreed, they will have a chance to scrutinise this. So, but I want to be very, very, very clear on this point, is that we are not compromising in terms of the environmental measures that we have in our country. They're hard won as a Conservative government. I'm really proud that this is what we are doing and supporting. And of course, if you look in the trade deals that we want to negotiate, we want to talk about how do we also expand the import and export of green goods, for instance.
The Resources Minister of Australia said the reports of coal's impending death are greatly exaggerated and its future is assured well beyond 2030. That doesn't sound like a government that is preparing to wind down its production of coal.
Well, let me make a wider point about coal, which is that if you look at the cost of renewables around the world, it is cheaper to install new renewables in the vast majority of the world than it is to have coal power plants. If you look at investments in coal, the private sector is increasingly reluctant to invest in coal because they can see these are going to become stranded assets. And actually, we talked about China. I mean, if you look at some of the statements coming out of some of the biggest banks in China which do financing of international coal, they've said that they're going to be setting out plans to phase down that financing of coal projects around the world. And I think, so we are seeing a move where coal will become consigned to history, but we do want every country to step up on this point.
All right. You've got a couple of days in New York to solve the problem. You must admit that what has happened this week must have made the environment, the climate, for those negotiations more difficult. The French are furious with us. The Americans, who knows where they are, there is a standoff all around, and the Chinese are really being aggressive on the American and British foreign policy. Your life must be being made much more difficult than it needs to be.
Well, Trevor, the last 18 months, and we've had all sorts of, bilateral matters, multilateral matters that have been going on over the past 18 months. I have been getting access, talking to governments. As I said, I've spoken to over 100 governments personally. And that is because people know that my focus is on climate. And they all understand the reason we need to solve this together. As I said, I'm told by every country that I meet, they want COP26 to be a success, and we need to hold them to it.
And what will success look like for you? What are the numbers that will come out of COP26 that will be successful?
Well, what we want to do is to ensure that we are limiting global warming. In the Paris Agreement, world leaders set out in 2015 that we would seek to limit the rise in global temperatures to well below 2 degrees, aiming for 1.5 degrees. And we want to get to a point where we can say that we have kept 1.5 alive. I want to make this really important point, because we talk as politicians about these numbers, and lots of people watching this will say, well, yeah, 1.5 degrees doesn't sound like a lot. But actually, currently, the world is 1.2 degrees warmer than before pre-industrial levels. And you are seeing the impact of that around the world. In our own country, you're seeing an increase in flooding, increase in rain, and that's just going to get worse. Rising sea levels, that's just going to get worse. And that's why we need to collectively work, and particularly the biggest emitters, the G20, need to come forward and set out ambitious plans to cut emissions.
Alok Sharma, thank you very much. We'll no doubt be talking again at Glasgow.
Thank you.
Thank you. OK, let's bring in the Green MP, Caroline Lucas, who's warned that the climate talks in Glasgow just got a lot harder. Good morning, Caroline Lucas.
Good morning.
You have probably been listening to what Alok Sharma's been saying. Do you believe him that he's got the makings of a deal?
I think he's doing his best, but I think his efforts at international diplomacy are being entirely undermined by government actions at home, as you pointed to in your questioning yourself. The first rule of diplomacy is to walk your talk. And yet both on the finance for climate and on the emissions reductions, this government is doing the opposite. It is absolutely outrageous that the government has cut our own aid budget by £4 billion and yet thinks it has the moral authority to lecture other countries about increasing their climate finance. We are in no position to do that when we have slashed our own aid budget. And when it comes to emission cuts, if you look at what government is actually doing, we are way off track in terms of meeting our own climate targets. The Committee on Climate Change, the government's independent advisors, says that we keep blundering into high carbon choices. You've got the Cumbria coal mine that you mentioned. You've got a new oil field being planned, the Cambo oil field off Shetland. You've got a £27 billion road building plan. You've got airport expansion. You've got the failure to put in place any kind of home insulation programme. The list goes on and on. So in terms of walking the talk, I'm afraid that Alok Sharma's very good efforts, I'm sure, at diplomacy are being cut off at the knees by the Prime Minister.
One of the striking things that Mr. Sharma told us is that he has not yet got an RSVP yes from the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Do you think that a deal that is sustainable can be struck without his presence?
I think that's almost impossible to envisage. No, it is absolutely essential that China is there. And that's why I am deeply concerned about this new so-called AUKUS deal, because we have just enraged the Chinese even more. If COP26, if this climate talks, these UN climate talks are our top diplomatic priority, then everything else should be taking second place to that. So I'm deeply worried about relations with China. I'm also deeply worried about relations with the developing world, because they too have the ability to walk away from these talks if they choose to. They were promised $100 billion a year by 2020. They were promised that right back in 2009, and we still haven't delivered. We are 20 billion short of that. Not only that, but just 2% of some countries in Africa have been fully vaccinated. So when it comes to equality, we are absolutely enraging as well the developing world, losing their trust, as well as losing the trust of countries like China.
Let's talk about opinion at home. I don't know if you were invited to the protests around the M25 or if you were free, but had you been invited and been free, would you have been out there blocking the road?
Well, Trevor, I have a proud history of taking non-violent direct action, as does the Green Party, and we do believe that it is legitimate when other forms of trying to raise issues with the government have failed. As long as it is non-violent, then I think we need to understand why protesters have taken this extreme action. You know, Ban Ki-moon, the former UN General Secretary, has said this is an emergency, and in emergency situations, we need to take emergency action. I believe that's what those protesters were doing. It is a really difficult thing to try to capture on a mild September Sunday, the fact that we are facing an existential threat to life on Earth. That feels a very odd thing to say over your breakfast, but that is what we are facing. When it comes to the demands of those protesters, they want the government to insulate Britain. I cannot think of a more reasonable demand. It's a triple win. It would get our fuel bills down. It would create hundreds of thousands of jobs in every part of the country. It would get our climate emissions down too. Why has the government failed to do that?
So I'm taking that as a yes, and that you think it's reasonable for this cause to stop people going to work, particularly those people who can't work from home. You think that's okay, and you would have been out there?
I think it is unreasonable for this government to have failed.
No. Let's just stick with the process itself. I know your view about the government. You think it's reasonable for them to have done what they did?
I'm saying that their demands are reasonable, and I'm saying
I'm asking you about what they did.
It is reasonable to take emergency action, and that's what they were doing. The government has failed to put in place any kind of insulation program. First of all, we had the Green Deal. That completely failed. It had interest rates of 8%, so that if people were taking loans to insulate their homes, that would have cost them a fortune. Then we had the Green Homes Grant. That has collapsed in absolute chaos. There is no program to keep people's homes warm. In the meantime, what's happening is that people are dying prematurely every year from fuel poverty. What's happening is that around 15% of our emissions in the UK are coming from our leaky housing stock. What is unreasonable is the fact that the government sets its face against a set of policies that would get our emissions down, that would get jobs up, that would get people's fuel bills down, and would address some of the issues you were talking to Alok about right at the start of this conversation, which was about the rising gas prices as well.
I fully understand your point about what you regard as the government's iniquities, but just to be absolutely clear, coming to the end now, you think this was a perfectly reasonable action. If they send you an invitation next time, you will be saying, yeah, I'll come and I will block the M25.
I am saying that in extreme situations, it is reasonable to take extreme actions. And that is what has driven these protesters to do that. Personally, I prefer to take action where it is closer to the target of that action. So that might be Downing Street, it might be the Treasury. But I fully understand why protesters have felt driven to do something more dramatic than that, because government has been ignoring all of those kinds of actions for many, many years. We face an existential crisis, an emergency, and we need to take emergency action now.
Thank you, Caroline Lucas. Now, Labour has accused the government of leaving the country over-reliant on imported gas and has called on ministers to do more to help families on low incomes, with household bills forecast to rise by as much as £400 a year. Pat McFadden is the Shadow Economic Secretary to the Treasury. Pat McFadden, the Business Secretary's called crisis talks with the suppliers tomorrow. If you were sitting in his seats, what would you be asking them to do?
Well, there's the short term and the long term. In the short term, what the Business Secretary must do is ensure continuity of supply. That's a basic duty of government for both domestic consumers and for businesses. And we've seen other ramifications of this over the last 24, 48 hours, for example, on food supplies, with CO2 being a necessary byproduct. And in the long term, what this has shown is the need to get on with the transition to net zero and the vulnerability of the reliance on fossil fuel markets, especially international ones. So there are things that you can't change because the situation is here and now, but this should act as a spur to get on with the transition to net zero, more renewable and sustainable supplies, because the effect of all this will be rising prices for consumers just when they're being hit with other things too.
Were you reassured by what Alok Sharma said about the continuity of supply during this winter?
Well, I've seen what he's said, and I've seen what the Business Secretary has said over the last 24 hours. I hope that's right, because continuity of supply is essential, as I said. But this really must act as a spur to avoid situations like this, where suddenly we're very exposed when there's an international price spike.
But what would you do to make sure that that doesn't happen? Because in a sense, part of this is a problem to do with an unforeseen event that's created a problem in the pipelines. I mean, how would you, if you were in government, deal with that or foresee that?
The immediate price spike may be unforeseen, but the reliance on international markets is foreseen. And you can do something about that by investing in your own storage capacity, by making sure you've got alternatives to gas. And we're going to have to do this for net zero anyway. So some of this may be unforeseen, but a lot of it should have been foreseen. And, you know, we can't be surprised by net zero like somebody being surprised by Christmas one year. We've got legislation that says we have to do this, and that means that government has to have a plan to get there.
Would part of Labour's plan be to cease the opening of new fossil fuel streams, for example, the Cambo oil field in Scotland or a new coal field in Cumbria? Would Labour simply say, we're not doing that?
Look, you know, on individual plans, they have to be judged on their merits, but the overall direction of travel has to be less reliance on fossil fuels, because there's no way to reach our net zero targets, which are shared across the political parties, unless we do that.
But you're sort of, if I may say so, echoing what Alok Sharma said. It's not really a decision we can make now. Why can't anybody just say, you know what, we don't want any more coal, we don't want any more oil, we're basically going to say no to these new developments?
Because I'm reluctant to comment on one application
well, I'll give you two.
At a time, but certainly the direction of travel must be that we decrease our reliance on fossil fuels, we increase our use of renewables. Let me give you a great example close to home, Trevor. My local hospital, New Cross in Wolverhampton, has announced that they will run themselves completely with their own solar farm, saving £15 to £20 million on energy bills over the next 20 years. All of that money will go back into frontline NHS care. So I think there's a great example close to my constituency in the town that I represent, which the government could take a lot of inspiration from.
Indeed, and my Sky News colleagues have been running a story on that this morning. But just let me make one last attempt. Why can't Labour simply say that there has to be a compelling emergency case for the government to agree to licence any new fossil fuel exploitation?
Well, the bar should be high for that, and there has to be a very convincing case given the overall arc of where we've got to get to on 2030. So I don't think these things should be approved just on the nod in the way that they would have been in the past, because that's not the future.
Okay.
The future is renewables and sustainable energy, and that's where we've got to get to.
Let's talk about your party. It's reported today that the MP for Canterbury, Rosie Duffield, has said she's not going to the Labour Party conference because she doesn't feel that her safety is assured because of comments and threats from activists who object to what she has to say, essentially that biological sex is a fact. The first duty of a government is to protect its people. How can we believe that Labour can be government when it can't even protect its own MPs?
Well, I'd be appalled if Rosie thought that she couldn't go to the Labour Party conference.
Well, she said she's not going.
Yeah, I've seen the article. Every MP should be safe at Labour Party conference or at their own party conference. We had this a few years ago, you may remember, with Luciana Berger. I was appalled then. And I think, first of all, I want Rosie to be able to go to conference. But more broadly here, I think there's an important cultural point about how we discuss things. Difficult issues have to be able to be discussed in a way that doesn't result in, if someone says something that someone else disagrees with, them being placed completely beyond the pale and subject to terrible online abuse or threats or anything like that. And we've got to find a way to work through issues where people can say things where someone else might disagree. And some of these issues are not easy without the consequence that you're talking about.
Can we assume that anybody who is associated with these kinds of threats will not be welcome themselves at the Labour Party conference if it can be demonstrated that they either supported, tweeted, shared in social media this kind of abuse of a Labour MP?
Yeah, that should be the case. And I think it also underlines the need for cultural change. We cannot have this kind of factionalism. We can't have this kind of intolerance. And, I'm convinced of the need for change in the Labour Party on many fronts. Okay. But the internal culture is certainly one of them. And I would say that Keir Starmer believes in this very strongly, and he's been very clear about this since he became leader.
Well, I shall be watching when I attend the Labour Party conference myself next week. Thank you, Pat McFadden. Now, more than 1 million people in England, and I should be one of them, will be sent an invitation this week to get a coronavirus booster jab. The Health Secretary said that the programme to provide additional protection to those aged 50 and over and frontline health workers would strengthen the wall of defence. Well, Professor Stephen Reicher is one of the government's scientific advisers, a member of the SAGE subcommittee advising ministers on behavioural science. Stephen Reicher, your students are returning to the campus at St Andrews this week. It's this week that triggered a fresh wave last year. What are you doing on campus to make sure we don't have a repetition?
Well, there are multiple measures that are going on in all universities. Across Scotland, for instance, there's very clear advice on the need to keep people safe, on the need to have testing, need to have vaccination, very clear messaging on the need to behave responsibly so you don't put others at harm. So I think, at least in Scotland, and I can speak for Scotland because I sit on the recovery group for universities in Scotland, every university has a very comprehensive plan about the return over the next few weeks, although actually in Scotland, most people have already got back. When you talk about what's happening, often it's very Anglo-centric and you forget Scotland.
I could never forget Scotland, Professor Reicher, but I just wanted to be absolutely sure that you feel confident that we're not going to have the same problems that we've had in the past. You feel confident about that at the moment?
Oh, I mean, there's huge uncertainty. I mean, simply put, we don't know what's going to happen, and that's true not just in universities, but more generally. As as schools have returning, they returned a while back in Scotland, and we've seen a spike in infections in young people. Now the data is beginning to come through in England. People returning to university, people returning to the workplace, people returning indoors because of because of the weather. All these are factors, and we can't know absolutely, but we have to be careful.
Well, we discussed all of those questions actually with the Scottish First Minister last Sunday, and it's clear that there's a slightly different point of view. You yourself have been pretty critical of the government, of the Johnson administration, for not underpinning its legal measures with behavioural science and behavioural nudges. Are you supportive of what they've done this week on travel restrictions?
I think the example of travel restrictions is an example where we had a dysfunctional system. Dysfunctional because of all the mess around getting PCR tests, all the different companies charging absurd rates, not providing a service, and so on. And they've responded not by improving the system, but by abandoning it entirely. And I think that's a pity. I do think we need PCR tests because everybody always said that lateral flow tests were never what were called green light tests to say you're safe and therefore we can you can act as if you don't have the virus. What they do is they pick up asymptomatic cases, and they're very, very valuable in that regard. I think it would have been far preferable to keep PCR tests, but to improve the system and to do them through the NHS. So I think it is increasing risk. I think it does limit. In fact, it stops our ability to trace different variants and increases the probability of infected people coming into the country. So I think it has increased the risk, quite frankly, and I think we should have improved the system rather than, by and large, abandoning it.
OK, so you're against the dropping of the PCR test. Do you think that the decision to offer booster jabs to everyone is actually a good step forward?
Well, rather than doing this piecemeal, let me give you my sense of the overall direction of travel we should have. Because if you remember back to last year, 21st of September last year, SAGE made a recommendation that we need to put protections in place in order to avoid the pandemic getting out of control. And the government ignored that. They ignored it for nearly 2 months. The pandemic got so far out of control that, as always happens, if you wait and things get out of control, you have to impose greater restrictions, which is why we had a non-Christmas and such an awful winter and spring. On the 8th of September this year, SAGE again made the point that actually we're in real danger. We can't be certain, but we're in danger of things running out of control. And rather than having to put in place severe restrictions later, let's do sensible things now. And the good place we're in, largely due to the vaccine, is that in order to get things under control, if you combine the vaccine, not with stringent lockdown, but with moderate protections and support for people, then you can bring even the Delta variant under control. And that's been shown in a range of countries. It's been shown in Israel, it's been shown in Denmark, it's been shown in Singapore. So what I would do is not restrict the public, not lock down the public, but increase the protections for the public. And let's take just one very simple example. When we talk about safety, we often focus on the individual. The individual must get vaccinated. It would be far more effective, I think, to make sure that environments are safe, that the pubs and the clubs and so on that we go into have got proper COVID standards. So why don't we have a proper licensing system, exactly the same way that we license kitchens to make sure that they don't to keep us safe. So protections, not restrictions, protections and support along with the vaccine, that will keep us safe.
Very briefly, there are nearly 6 million people who, either because they couldn't be bothered or because they are actively opposed to it, have not been vaccinated. Very briefly, is there any way that you can see to get those people jabbed?
Yes. First of all, as you say, most people who are not vaccinated aren't vaccine hesitant or anti-vax. They simply haven't got round to it. So make it easier for them by bringing vaccine stations into schools, into universities, into workplaces. Make sure that people can have paid time off to get vaccinated. So make it easy. Bring the vaccine to the people. That's number one. Number two is to give clear and consistent information as to why vaccines are important. And if you spread a message implicitly or explicitly that infections don't matter, then people are going to think, why should I get vaccinated? And the third and the most important is, amongst those who have doubts, don't treat them as fools, don't treat them as the enemy, don't push them away, don't push them into the hands of the anti-vaxxers. Build trust, show respect, listen to people, address their concerns, and as I say, win them over. Trust is absolutely critical, and that's one of the things our government has forgotten. Build trust, don't distrust the public.
Professor Reicher, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, the new Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, has said that the decision to share nuclear technology with Australia shows the UK's readiness to be hard-headed in defending our interests. France is furious at being excluded from the tripartite talks with Washington and Canberra, not to mention losing out on a submarine contract worth some £47 billion. Leon Panetta has served as White House Chief of Staff, head of the CIA, and the US Defense Secretary. He told us that the French should really be more supportive. More on that in a moment, but first, I began by asking him for his reaction to this week's admission that one of America's last acts in Afghanistan, a drone strike in Kabul, had killed 10 innocent people.
It's not good news. Look, drone strikes are weapons of war, and you have to exercise tremendous caution when you're targeting with a drone. As someone who's been involved with drone operations as director of the CIA, I thought it was very important to have intelligence not only using our surveillance capability, but also using people on the ground, spies on the ground, to identify those targets and make sure that we had the right targets when we fired. In this instance, it's pretty clear that that kind of care was not exercised, and a terrible mistake has been made. And it does reflect badly, I think, on the approach that was used to decide what target to hit. I know there was a tremendous amount of confusion. I know there was a tremendous amount of pressure to try to go after those that had killed our Marines and killed others. But that's no excuse for not developing accurate information when it comes to targeting individuals.
Do you think that this kind of mistake, let's call it that, weakens the United States' hand in its foreign policy and its work to try to extend its influence across the globe?
Well, look, any time this kind of mistake is made, it reflects badly in terms of the methodology of applying our technology to targets on the ground. Now, having said that, we live in a very dangerous world, and we're dealing with a lot of adversaries, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's Iran, whether it's North Korea, whether it's failed states in the Middle East, whether it's terrorism. And the fact is that we still are at war with terrorism. I think the result in Afghanistan is that we have a Taliban that will probably continue to provide safe haven to terrorists like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Haqqanis and others. And so we're going to have to make sure that in dealing with that threat to our national security, yes, we're going to need the very best intelligence we can get on those targets. To the extent that a mistake was made here, yes, it's something that we have to worry about. We have to investigate as to what happened, and we have to make sure that it never happens again.
Can I turn now to wider issues of foreign policy? Is it fair to say that the Biden administration's foreign policy has just one overwhelming priority: China?
Well, there's no question that China is a priority, but I'm not sure you can call it the only overwhelming priority we have. We're probably facing more flashpoints in the world than we faced since the end of World War II, because it isn't just China. It's also Russia, which has become much more aggressive in their actions, particularly towards the United States. Iran is continuing to enrich fuel and is getting closer to the capability of having a nuclear weapon. North Korea is now firing more missiles and developing more nuclear weapons. And we are continuing to see terrorism, and we're continuing to see cyber attacks, which is the battlefield of the future. So we're dealing with a lot of threats. And yes, China is one of those. But the United States has to be capable of being able to respond to national security threats across the board. And that means that we have to be strong enough militarily and diplomatically to be able to deal with those challenges.
When you were the Chief of Staff in the White House, your administration was pretty clear on China. It thought that the globalization and economic growth would lead to greater freedom and a different relationship with China and reforming China itself. It hasn't worked out that way, has it?
Unfortunately, it has not worked out that way. And there's been a lot of mistakes along the way. I think President Obama was right when he talked about rebalancing our force to the Pacific. I was Secretary of Defense when we made that decision. And it was important to do that in order to make clear to China that, yes, we will work with them, we will have dialogue with them, we'll try to deal with them economically and financially as we have. But at the same time, we are also going to protect our national interests when it comes to the Pacific, which means that the South China Sea cannot be an area that limits the ability of shipping and free trade and freedom of the seas to be able to take place. It means that we have to respect human rights. It means that we have to protect Taiwan. It means that we have to make sure that the right thing is done with regards to Hong Kong as well. So, yes, we can have that dialogue. But at the same time, I think we have to be prepared in order to show China that there are lines that they cannot cross.
Is the pact signed this week between the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines a preparation, as you've just talked about, or is it, as the Chinese are saying, a provocation?
I think it's about engagement, and I think it's about deterrence. I think that's the message that they should get. I think that the most important thing that needs to be done in dealing with China is to strengthen our alliances. The one thing the Chinese don't do very well is have allies. That's not something that works well for them. Same thing is true for Russia. They don't like other countries developing alliances that might limit them in the decisions they make. And so I think the fact that we announced this security partnership and that we made clear that we are going to be able to exchange not only intelligence, but also technologies, and we're going to help provide nuclear-powered submarines to the Australians so that they can have that capability. Okay. I think what that does is it sends a message to China that we are not going to simply sit back and allow China to have its way in the Pacific.
But there's a price to pay here, isn't there? And that is in the terms of America's own allies. The deal that you signed with the UK and Australia has made the French furious. The French foreign minister described it as a stab in the back, and the Élysée Palace has recalled its ambassador to the United States. This is a misstep, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure of just exactly what kind of conversations went on with regards to our allies, France and others as well. I would hope that when this kind of partnership is announced, that our other allies would support that kind of partnership, because very frankly, the role of allies is to build partnerships and to be able to work together when it comes to security, when it comes to our economics, when it comes to trade, et cetera. That's the heart and soul of having allies.
Let me just ask you this, though. That the French said that this behaviour looks like something that Mr. Trump would do. Isn't that the biggest insult that anybody could level at a Biden White House?
Well, yeah, and it's probably not accurate because I'm not sure that President Trump had the ability to develop the kind of partnerships that the Biden administration developed in this case, the kind of strategic partnership between the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States. That was not something that Trump was very interested in doing.
But you see my point.
It's a criticism, but I don't think it's based on fact.
But you see my point here, that the Biden administration is about to go into COP26. It's meant to give the world leadership. It's meant to bring people together. But by its actions, the pulling out of Afghanistan, this particular thing with the French, that it is alienating potentially people it's going to need to help it do the deal at COP26, for example.
Look, I think President Biden has made clear that the United States wants to exercise world leadership and wants to work with our allies in the world. And, have mistakes been made? Of course they've been made. But overall, I think that it's pretty clear that this president understands the importance of countries working together in order to provide for our mutual security. And I guess to some extent, look, there is a problem here because after watching Trump, a lot of our allies basically were very distrustful of the United States. I understand that. And we're starting to operate on their own. And France is a good example of that. But I also think that they should recognize that we have a different president who is interested in trying to work with the rest of the world. And we will have our differences. We will make mistakes.
Okay.
But in the end, if we're confronting common adversaries, as we are in China and Russia and elsewhere, then we damn well better start working together.
Mr. Panetta, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
The view from the United States there. France has a very different take on the new defence pact between the United Kingdom, the United States and Australia. The Élysée Palace has recalled its ambassador from Washington for the first time since 1793. Well, I'm joined now by a more recent representative of the French Republic, Gerard Araud. Monsieur Araud, bienvenue. You heard the interview with Mr. Panetta there, and I suppose his attitude could best be described as je ne regrette rien. Why isn't France cheering for this alliance between its two NATO allies?
Good morning. Well, first, you have to understand that what was at stake for France was much more than a contract, because providing 12 submarines to Australia was for us a strategic choice. We wanted to build a strategic partnership, which would be the pillar of our Indo-Pacific strategy. Two French presidents visited recently Australia. It's 20 hours of flight from Paris. But there were a lot of meetings. Our navies were training together. A few weeks ago, there were big training between Indian, French, and Australian navies. And so suddenly, not only we lose an important contract, but a strategic partnership is thrown away overnight. And there is another partnership which is created, announced at least, and France is excluded from the partnership. And also, I think the Americans and the Australians have had injuries, insults to the injury, because suddenly we discover they've been plotting in our back for weeks and months. We are allies, it's not a way of treating allies.
But there's absolutely no reason why the United Kingdom and the United States can't be allies both with Australia and with France, and also Australia can be an ally with us and with France. Tell the truth here. You lost out on a commercial deal. 4.7 billion is a lot of money, and you are just cross about it.
Well, first, on the figures, really, on what you said, 47 billion British pounds, I think to the French, it was only something like 6 or 7 billions, because the rest was for buying American weapon system and for building them in Australia, where you don't have actually shipyards. So it was not, really, it was not 50 billion British pounds taken from the French. Really, it was an important, but it was not that critical.
So why make such a big fuss about it?
No, but there is the first, and I insist on that. The first is political. Really, as I've said, we have been undercut in what we considered as a very important political choice, and we have been undercut by our closest allies, in a sense. The way it has been done is amazing. Really, we were not consulted, we were not warned, and basically we were told through the TV. Think of it, for months, British, Americans, Australians have been plotting in our back, basically saying, we are going to take these contracts from the French. You don't behave this way between allies. Again, France has been the first European country active in the Indo-Pacific area. Right now you have aircraft carrier, British aircraft carrier there, but our aircraft carrier was there 3 years ago.
All right. Well, you're making the case that this isn't what might look from London like a fit of pique. But explain one thing which is a puzzle here in London. You withdrew ambassadors from Canberra and Washington, but not London.
Well, I think, we don't consider that the UK has been really has played a critical role. As you know, a lot of the so-called UK technology in the nuclear field, as for the nuclear deterrence force, is actually American and depending on the Americans. So we considered that the role of the UK, in a sense, was subsidiary, that the impulse was coming from Canberra on one side and from Washington on the other one.
Is that a not very diplomatic way of saying that London isn't very important in French calculations anymore?
I really, again, I'm not a diplomat anymore, but I think our Minister of Foreign Affairs has said that in this history, as we say in French, the UK has been the fifth wheel of the carriage.
Well, it seems that the one thing that's not in much supply here is diplomacy. Was it very diplomatic for you to tweet that the UK is now run by a Monty Python government?
Well, really announcing that the UK is going back to imperial measures. It's really, and so it will join Myanmar and the US. It's frankly, it's amazing. It makes, it's really, I think for me, it's extremely funny. And again, I'm not a diplomat anymore. I was an ambassador, but I'm retired, and I'm using the freedom of retirement to say what I believe.
All right. Well, let's leave for the moment what our Americans would say would call a French diss of London, and let's just return to France itself. Are we seriously here seeing the beginnings of a return under President Macron to a kind of Gaullism, an independent French foreign policy?
Well, so first, I think, again, let's go beyond the storm of the today's storm. And we had President Obama, which really was totally indifferent towards Europe. I was ambassador at the time. After that, we had Trump, who was hostile towards Europe. And now you have President Biden. As you have said yourself, there was Afghanistan, and now there is this story. But frankly, when President Biden came to Europe in June, there was, on the American side, absolutely no show of interest for a real cooperation with the Europeans. The European Union had sent to Washington a long list of potential fields of cooperation, and nothing came out of Washington. So I think it's natural that today we raise the question, saying, basically, Europeans wake up, basically the Americans are having pivoted so much to Asia, to China, as you have said.
Okay.
The Americans don't care so much about Europe. You look, Ukraine, Syria, Libya, the Sahel, all our environment is in flames, and the Americans are not there. So that's the reason why President Macron is saying maybe we should have what he calls strategic autonomy. It's not anti-American. It's simply looking at what America is today.
OK. Monsieur Arnaud, merci et à bientôt.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Well, that's it from us this week. Stay with us for The Take, for analysis of today's show with Sky's Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates.